Lesson 44, Deponent and Semi-Deponent Verbs, the ablative with utor, etc. Hi everyone, welcome back to Lenny's Latin class. Today we are on Lesson 44, that's on page 133 of the textbook, and today we'll be talking about a special kind of verb called the deponent verb. So let's jump right into section 355 and let's talk about deponent verbs. First of all, let's ask the question, what is a deponent verb? A deponent verb, as the book says, is a verb that is passive in form but active in meaning. So when you look at a deponent verb, it will appear like a passive verb. It will look like it because it'll have all those forms and endings. In Greek and Latin, when we talk about the different forms that a word can have, we refer to that as morphology, from the Greek word morphe, which means shape. So with the word morphology, we might say that a deponent verb has the morphology of a passive verb, but it's not passive. It is actually active. And the standard way that people explain the name deponent, the standard way that they explain that is that it comes from the Latin verb depono. You probably already know the verb pono, which means to put or place. Pono, ponere, posui, positum. It's a third conjugation verb. And as you can probably recognize from all the forms I just mentioned, the four principal parts, we get English words from it like position or positive, words like that. And with the preposition de prefixed to it, you get the verb depono. And so the idea of depono is that you put something down or set it aside. And so the standard way that they explain the name of this kind of verb, that is calling it deponent verbs, the way they explain it is that it's verbs that have set aside their active forms. They depono their active forms, leaving only the passive forms. I'm not sure how linguistically accurate that is, but it probably is largely true, and it's a good way to remember what deponent verbs are, especially if you're a student. So you may be asking yourself the question, why is it that deponent verbs are the way they are? Why is it that they are passive in form, but active in meaning? How did they get that way? And so while we're on the subject, I'd like to say a few words about that, just to satisfy what I hope is your curiosity on that topic. I did a little bit of reading, and it's kind of a long story, but I'm going to tell you the short version, or as short as I can possibly make it. By now you may have noticed that I'm a bit long-winded. But anyway, here goes. All the languages that stretch from India through the Slavic territories in Eastern Europe all the way to Western Europe, all that territory contains languages that are all related in one big language family. It's called the Indo-European language family. Indo, I-N-D-O, and then a dash, and then European. The Indo is there referring to India, and European, of course, refers to Europe. So Indo-European means stretching from India through Europe. So scholars believe that all the languages in this language family all stem from a mother language known as, well, sometimes it's just called Indo-European, other times it's called Proto-Indo-European. And in the Proto-Indo-European language, the language that all the other languages in that family come from, French, Spanish, German, Slavic languages like Russian or Czech, the classical language of India, which is Sanskrit, other ancient languages like Hittite, ancient Greek, all those languages are in the Indo-European language family. Okay, so in the mother language, the mother tongue, which scholars call Indo-European, there were only two voices in the verb system. What do I mean by voice? Well, you've already got some experience working with the active voice and the passive voice. there's a third voice to talk about, which is called the middle voice. Okay, let's talk about that a minute. It's called the middle voice because it's in the middle between active and passive. Let's use the verb to wash as an example of how to explain this. The verb wash can be used in different ways. If I use it actively in the active voice, I could say, in the first person singular, I could say, I wash. I could say, I wash the car. I wash the dog. I wash the dishes. That is the active voice. The verb wash in each of those sentences is active. It's in the active voice. The subject is I, the verb is wash, and then we have a direct object. So that's active. Also, there is passive. I could say, I am being washed, or I am washed. In those examples, the subject is still I, but the action is happening to me passively. So those sentences contain passive verbs. I am being washed, that's first person singular, passive voice. Active is I wash the car. Passive is I am being washed. And then often with passive verbs like that, you'll have some kind of agent stated, that is the person that's doing that action. So there's active voice, I wash, and there's passive voice, I am being washed. But there's a third voice to talk about too, which is called the middle voice. And as the name suggests, it is somewhere in the middle between active and passive. The way that teachers explain the middle voice, and the way you'll see it in textbooks, generally speaking, is explained this way, that it's one of two things. It's action that is done reflexively upon the subject. In other words, I could say, I am doing something to myself, or it's activity done with some kind of self-interest or self-involvement. So the middle voice can express reflexive action or action with self-interest. So let's try that with the verb wash. How can I do the middle voice with the verb wash? I can say, well, I wash myself. So the subject of the sentence is I, and the direct object in the sentence is the same party. Okay, so I wash me, or I wash myself. That kind of action is reflexive because it goes back to the subject. So that's a classic example of how the middle voice can be used. Another way is action that's done with some kind of self-interest. So if all the dishes in the kitchen are clean, but I just wash one dish just for myself, in other words, I don't want to do all the dishes so they're all clean for everyone. I just want to be selfish and just get one dish and wash it just for me to use to make my cereal or whatever. So I could say, I'm just going to wash this one dish for myself. That's kind of sort of what it's like in the middle voice when it's done in such a way that it's done for self-interest. With the verb wash, if it's active, I could say, I wash the car. If it's passive, I could say, I am being washed. But if it's middle, I could say, I wash myself, or I wash something for myself. The middle voice is some kind of expression that has a strong connection with the person doing the action. If I say, I wash the car, I am the subject, but the thing being washed is some other party. If I say, I am being washed, someone else is doing the action, and I'm the recipient of that. But with the middle voice, there's a sense of strong involvement with the person who's the subject of the sentence and the person doing the action. There's a strong sense that the action is strongly associated with the person doing the action. So that's the idea with the middle voice. So how does this apply or pertain to Indo-European? I'm going to read you a little bit from a book called The Latin Language by L.R. Palmer. This is from page 262. And I'm just going to paraphrase here a bit. It says here on page 262 that Indo-European had two voices. It had the active voice and it had the middle voice. So the mother tongue of Latin, Greek, French, Sanskrit, all those languages, the mother tongue had active and middle. And so with active, you have the subject of the sentence acting upon some other party. But here's the part I want to emphasize about the middle voice. He says here on page 262, in the middle, the action was conceived as operating in or on the subject. The action takes place in the person of the subject, to the interest of the subject, etc. It says the action takes place in the person of the subject or to the interest of the subject. So if I say, I wash myself, the action is taking place on me, the subject of the sentence. And if I say, I wash a dish for myself, then that's in the interest of the subject, which is me, I. And so basically, again, Indo-European had active and middle, and then those same verbs that were used to express the middle voice, they also got used to express the passives. Apparently, this was some kind of development where the same verbs that would express the middle got adapted. Palmer mentions the addition of other helping words like pronouns, I think he mentioned. So you have one form of a verb in Indo-European to say something active. Then you have another form that covers middles and passives. So here's how this applies to us. In ancient Greek, you have all three of those voices surviving. Ancient Greek has active, middle, and passive. In some tenses, there's a separate form for each one. In other tenses, there's only one separate form for active and then another separate form that's the same for middle and passive. Very much like the way it was described in Indo-European. When it's the same for middle and passive, the form of the verb, in ancient Greek that is, it doesn't tell you which one it is. You have to use the context to figure it out. So in ancient Greek, you've got active, middle, and passive. In Latin, we don't really have middles. In Latin, what happened apparently is the Indo-European middle and passive came into Latin just as passive. So that is why in Latin we have deponent verbs, is they have that same morphology, that same form as passives, but they have some kind of quality that is similar to a middle voice verb. But the morphology is the same. Remember, in Indo-European, the form was the same for middle voice and passive voice. So that is why deponent verbs in Latin are the way they are, is because they come from Indo-European, in which middles and passives had the same morphology. And then somehow over time, as we go from, ancient, super ancient times before recorded history, the language just develops and changes, and then it comes into Latin with, regular verbs, passive forms, plus some deponents. So this comes from the verbal setup of Indo-European. One last quick thing before we move on. Keep in mind that a middle voice verb can have a direct object. For example, if I say the verb wash, and I try to say it in a middle voice kind of way, I could say, I wash myself, or I'm washing a dish just for me, just for myself. Keep in mind that if I say, I wash myself, that's reflexive, and I am the object of the activity. I'm the subject and the object of it. But if I say, I wash a dish for myself, still the word dish in that sentence still is a direct object. It's for me, it's in my interest. Nevertheless, there is a direct object in that sentence. So a middle voice verb in whatever language can have the reflexive nature that, the subject is the object of the activity, both subject and object, but it can also take a direct object that's outside of the, subject of the sentence. So there are a couple of different flavors of middle voice verbs. There can be transitive ones and intransitive ones. A transitive verb is a verb that has a direct object, like wash. An intransitive verb is a verb that does not have a direct object. For example, swim. If I just say, I swim, there's no direct object. It's just I'm swimming. Or if I say, I die, there's no direct object. You can't die someone, D-I-E. It's just, you're just saying that you're doing that action. So some verbs have the ability to take a direct object. We call those verbs transitive verbs. Sometimes you'll hear them called valent verbs. Other times you'll have verbs that cannot take a direct object, like swim or die. We call those intransitive verbs. So for middle voice verbs, in Indo-European or Greek or whatever, a middle voice verb can have a direct object. So what it appears like, what it looks like, is that verbs from Indo-European that were middle voice verbs came into Latin with the same morphology as passive verbs, but they seem to have some kind of self-interest. They seem to have a kind of middle voice quality. Maybe that changed or slipped away over time. Languages change over time. The way people use words, it changes. Meanings change, spellings change, pronunciations change. But here's the big idea, is that in Indo-European, you had active verbs and then middle voice verbs. And those middle voice verbs were used to express the passive too. So middle and passive had the same form, same morphology, and then that gets passed down into other languages with various changes, additions, subtractions, mutations. Things stop being used, things start being used. They start using the same old verb, but with a new helping verb or a new kind of way to phrase it. Things changed. And so that's the big idea of why we have deponent verbs in Latin, is because of the way they developed from this much older proto-language known as Proto-Indo-European or Indo-European. So that's the story of how we got these verbs in Latin. Now we go on to the task of just mastering them. We have to learn their forms. We have to figure out how to use them. We have to get accustomed to how they work. But they are actually active in meaning. So what do we do with these deponent verbs? Verbs that only have passive forms, no active forms. What do we do with them? Well, let's look at the chart a little more closely here in section 356. In the first conjugation, we have hortor. Hortor appears to be first person singular, indicative, present tense, passive, like I am being something. But because it's a deponent verb, you translate it actively. It means to encourage or to urge. And so hortor means I encourage, or I urge, or I exhort. The infinitive form, that is the present infinitive, hortari, it appears to be a passive infinitive, to be something. But that's not the case. It's actually to do something. It's active. In this case, it's to exhort, to encourage, to urge. And then hortatus sum, that looks like a perfect tense passive verb. I was something. That's what it looks like. But because it's a deponent verb, we translate that actively. So hortatus sum would be a male saying, I encouraged. Notice here that these verbs in the perfect stem are gendered. It's a perfect passive participle plus a verb of being, exactly as you would form the passive perfect stem of any regular verb. It looks just like that, except we translate it as active. So these are gendered forms. You have a participle plus a verb of being. So if it's a man or boy saying it, he'll say hortatus sum, I urged. If it's a woman or girl saying it, she'll say hortata sum, I urged. And if it's something neuter saying it, like a town, oppidum, the town encouraged someone to do something. Then you have a neuter participle, hortatum sum, or perhaps hortatum est. Probably the town can't talk, so it probably won't be hortatum sum, but who knows? Maybe something neuter can talk. So for hortor, it looks like I am being encouraged, to be encouraged, and I was encouraged. That's what it looks like based on its form or morphology. But because it's a deponent verb, it looks passive, but we translate it as active. So hortor says, I urge. Hortari means to urge. And hortata sum says, I urged. Again, these perfect forms really are a participle plus a verb of being. So really it adds up to this. It adds up to I am having encouraged in the past. It's really two words. We call this a compound tense. Remember, a compound verb is a verb that has a preposition stuck to the front of it. Like if you have the verb winio and you add con to the front, you get conwinio. So we say that verb is compounded, or we call it a compound verb. But then you have also something called a compound tense, which is a tense that is made up of two words. So hortatus sum is what we call a compound tense because it takes two words to express it. Another term to be familiar with is the periphrastic. In Greek and Latin, when you have a participle plus a verb of being expressing a verb, we call that a periphrastic tense. You've already seen this in the passive periphrastic when you say that something must be done or someone must do something, like faciendum est. It is to be done in the sense of it must be done. We call that a passive periphrastic because it takes the participle and the word est, both of those words working together to express it. So participle plus verb of being, that's a periphrastic tense. And so that's what we have here with hortatus sum, and any perfect tense passive verb. Those are all what we can call periphrastic verbs because they include a participle and a verb of being. So a quick review there of some of the things you see in the perfect tense for passive verbs. So hortatus sum says, I am having encouraged. And when you put those two thoughts together, it adds up to I encouraged. In the past, I encouraged someone or urged someone. Sum says I am, and then hortatus says having already encouraged in the past, and that action is completed. Remember that that's the nature of the perfect tense, is that it's completed action in past time. So hortatus sum, I am in a state of already having encouraged someone. Or a shorter way to say it is I encouraged. Again, we're translating hortatus not as a passive participle, but as active because this is a deponent verb. Moving on to the second conjugation, vereor, that says I fear, not I am feared. It looks passive because it's deponent. Vereri is the present tense infinitive. It looks passive, but it's really active. It means to fear. Veritus sum is perfect tense. It says, I feared. Remember, it's a participle plus a verb of being, a periphrastic tense. Veritus sum says, I am in a state of already having feared. So add it all up, and it says, I feared in the past. Perfect tense. From the third conjugation, we have an extremely common verb, sequor, which means to follow. So sequor says, I follow. Sequi is the present tense infinitive. That means to follow. Note the special form of that infinitive there. It's not, sequeri or something like that. You have that shortened stem in the third conjugation for the infinitive. And then secutus sum means I followed. That's perfect tense. Again, it's a perfect tense participle plus a verb of being, present tense verb of being. So I am in a state of already having followed, meaning I followed. So sequor, sequi, secutus sum is an extremely common one. From the fourth conjugation, potior, potiri, potitus sum, that means to take possession of. And we're going to circle back around to that one later because that one has a special characteristic that you need to know about. So quick review, certain verbs in Latin are what we call deponent verbs. They look passive, but we translate them as active. Moving on to section 357, there are a few verbs in Latin that are known as semi-deponent. We call them semi-deponent because they're active in some tenses, but in other tenses, they have passive form with active meaning. So they're just deponent in certain tenses, not all the tenses. So we call them semi-deponent, and there aren't very many of them. There are just a few. So if you turn the page to the next page, which is 134, you'll see these listed. There are just 4 of them. I think there are more than 4, but these are considered the 4 most common, the ones that you might actually be likely to see on a fairly common basis in Latin literature. So 4 of them here, audeo, gaudeo, soleo, and fido. Audeo, notice that in the present tense, we have audeo and then audere. It's second conjugation. But then when you get into the perfect tense or perfect stem, suddenly we have ausus sum. So it's only deponent in the perfect, what we might call the perfect system. That is perfect, pluperfect, future perfect, all the tenses that pertain to completed action. And this verb means to dare. If I say audeo, that means I dare in the sense of I dare to rush into battle or something like that. I believe this is related to our English word audacious. Next, we have the verb gaudeo, which means to rejoice. Gaudere is the present infinitive. Notice that it's second conjugation. But then in the perfect system, we have gavisus sum, and that's deponent. So gavisus sum means I rejoiced, not I was rejoiced, but I rejoiced. So again, that's semi-deponent because it's deponent only in the perfect system. The only English word I can think of that's related to gaudeo is the word gaudy, G-A-U-D-Y, gaudy. In British English, that word means some kind of special dinner or a banquet, some kind of celebratory dinner. Of course, in American English, we have the word gaudy, which means over-decorated or in poor taste, something like that. I don't know if that's related, but definitely the British word gaudy, meaning a reunion dinner, that definitely does come from this verb. So we at least have one related word. Whenever I introduce a new vocabulary word, I always try to give you a related English word to help you remember it, but sometimes there isn't a good one. So I'm sort of reaching for one here with the verb gaudeo. Next we have soleo, solere, solitus sum. Notice that in the present tense, it's just a regular verb, but then in the perfect system, it becomes deponent. So in Latin, if you want to say that you're accustomed to doing something, you can say soleo, and then you can say an infinitive to say whatever it is you're accustomed to. In other words, if you want to say, I'm accustomed to walking to the store every day, you can say soleo, ambulare ad tabernam, blah, blah, blah. That's one way to use it. I think you can use it in other ways too. Finally, fido, fidere, fisus sum. This looks like a third conjugation verb, and this verb means to trust. We do have lots of related English words, but they come from when this verb is compounded with con, becoming confido. So we have English words like confidence and confide or confidential. Without the con, we also have words like fiduciary. Words like that pertain to finances. There's the idea of trust. You trust that someone will, come up with the money. Also in English, we have the word affidavit, which is a law term. That's really the verb fido with ad on the front, and the D turns into an F, long story. So that's another one that has this root word in it. Okay, so quick review. We've looked at deponent and semi-deponent verbs. The way you can start to work with these verbs is just to know each one individually and just to know which ones are deponent. As you gain more experience, that will become easier. As you get accustomed to working with these different verbs, you'll just start to recognize them. You'll see a certain form of a verb and you'll say, oh, I know that verb, that's deponent. And then you know to translate it as active, even though it looks passive. So as with everything else in Latin, you just get used to it over time. With that in mind, let's take a look at a few vocabulary words here in section 358. We have lots of new verbs that are all deponent and a few new nouns too. First of all, we have jus juris, which means right or justice. With that particular noun, you have to use the context to figure out what it's saying. Sometimes it can even mean law in certain contexts, if I remember correctly. Notice that the genitive singular form is juris and the genitive stem is iur. That first letter I there is what we call a consonantal I. So as those words come into English, the consonantal I turns into a J. And so that's where we get our English word juris, like jurisprudence, or a law degree is called a juris doctor, a juris doctorate. English words like jury. So you'll see lots of legal terms that include that root there. Next we have urbs, urbis, which means city. That's a feminine noun. From what I've read in textbooks, the way you're supposed to pronounce this word is like URPS, urbs. In languages, you have certain sounds that are voiced and certain sounds that are voiceless. In layman's terms, a voiced sound, a voiced consonant, is a consonant that, as you pronounce it, your vocal cords are vibrating. A voiceless consonant is a consonant that, when you pronounce it, your vocal cords are not vibrating. So, for example, the letter V, as in vine, the letter V is a voiced consonant. As I say the letter V, my vocal cords are vibrating. Vine. But the letter F is voiceless. If I say the word fine, listen to the letter F. Fine. As I said the letter F, my vocal cords were not vibrating. So V and F really are the same letter or the same sound, but one has vocal cords vibrating and the other does not. So I can turn a V into an F simply by turning off my vocal cords. And I can turn the F sound back into a V sound by starting up my vocal cords. So V and F, those two letters are an example of a pair of consonants that we could call voiced and voiceless. Same with S and Z. S and Z are the same, but one's voiced and one is voiceless. The Z is just an S with vocal cords vibrating, and an S is just a Z without your vocal cords vibrating. Same with P and B. P says p, p, p. Do the same thing with your vocal cords vibrating, and you get a B. B, 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 b. Same with D and T. D is voiced, T is voiceless. Why do I bring this up? Because here in the word urbs, we have the letter B, which in English would be voiced, But in Latin, what they say is to pronounce it in this position here, in this word, pronounce it as voiceless. So urps is how you would say this word, as if it were spelled URPS. Why is that? I think it's because the letter S that follows it is also voiceless in Latin, and so the B becomes voiceless to match it. So if this were an English word, we'd say the B and the S with our vocal cords vibrating. We would say herbs, herbs. But in Latin, I think the way you're supposed to say it is with the B and the S both voiceless, resulting in something like urps. In the genitive singular form, urbis, I think it's okay to have the B as voiced, not voiceless. So urps, urbis is the word for city, and of course we get our English word urban from this. If something is urban, it's related to a city. Also suburban and suburbs. Notice how in the word suburbs, that English word, the B and the S at the end were both voiced. But in Latin, as I explained a moment ago, I think they would be voiceless. So a little bit of a linguistic lesson there for you. Just throwing in that linguistic stuff just for your knowledge. Next, we have the word cum. Now, you already know the word cum as a preposition that means with, and it takes the ablative. But here we're seeing the word cum in a completely different context. We're seeing cum here as a conjunction. And this conjunction is actually a bit complicated. It can introduce several different kinds of clauses. You can see the meanings listed here: when, while, since, although. So take special note of this, that is the word cum, not as a preposition, but as a conjunction. Keep your eye on that one because we're going to have some special ways to use that to introduce different kinds of clauses. We'll be able to say things like, although blah, blah, blah happened, such and such happened anyway. You can do that with this cum conjunction. Since I was already going to the store, I decided to go ahead and stop by the dry cleaners too. You can do that kind of thing with the word cum. So you get the idea. Cum as a conjunction can introduce all kinds of different clauses, which we will study more about later. Now we have a whole pile of new verbs, which are all deponent verbs. So let's dig into this big pile of new vocabulary. Arbitror, arbitrari, arbitratus sum is a deponent verb that means to think or suppose. A related English word is arbitration or arbitrate because you're judging something. Next we have conor, conari, conatus sum, which means to try, as in attempt. I can't really think of a very good related English word. There's a word conative, which is kind of a grammar term that means when a verb is expressing that someone's trying to do something, you could call that a conative verb. That's the only one I can think of. Next we have incito, incitare, incitavi, incitatum. This is not a deponent verb. This is just a normal verb. Of course, we get our English word incite from this. If you incite violence, you rouse up violence or urge on violence. Incito is just a simple first conjugation verb. And the reason it's first conjugation, I think, is because it's a special kind of verb called a frequentative. There's also a verb in Latin called cio, C-I-O, which has to do with rousing and stirring things up. And when you add in the T and change it from cio to quito, that makes it a special kind of verb called a frequentative. If a verb is a frequentative, that means that someone is doing the action repeatedly. So cio, C-I-O, that might mean someone is stirring something up, but quito, as a frequentative, might be that someone is repeatedly trying to get something stirred up, more of a continuous or repetitive action. And so as you can see here, quito is prefixed with the verb in, so incito. By the way, all frequentatives become first conjugation verbs. No matter what conjugation a verb is from, if you make it into a frequentative, it automatically becomes first conjugation. So that is why the verb incito here is first conjugation. Incito, incitare, incitavi, so on and so forth. It's first conjugation because it is a frequentative. And all frequentatives automatically become first conjugation verbs, regardless of what the verb is that they're based upon. Next we have vagor, vagari, vagatus sum, which means to wander around, roam around. As I take a look at the dictionary, it seems that our English word vagrant could be related to vagor. It's hard to tell. I think we get our word vagrant through French, but that French word may have come from this verb. So I'm not sure, but I think this is related to our English word vagrant, because a vagrant is someone who wanders around and doesn't have basically a homeless person. Next, we have another deponent verb, ex sequor, which, as you can see, is just sequor compounded with the preposition ex. In Caesar, we'll see this as part of an idiom, along with the noun jus. So jus and ex sequor apparently means to enforce a right or enforce justice. We'll see that coming up, I'm sure, in our Caesar reading. Another deponent verb, morior, mori, mortuus sum, which means to die. Lots of related English words like mortuary, mortician, also the noun mortis in Latin means death. So we have the expression post mortem, literally after death. It's when you examine a corpse to see what the person died of. So that verb is not too hard to remember. Next we have profaciskor, another deponent verb that means to depart or set out. Profaciskor, profaciski, profectus sum. It's related to another Latin word, the noun profectio, which means departure. And you can see how the perfect stem, the perfect participle, profectus, you can see how that is very closely related to profectio. Now, you may remember a few minutes ago I was speculating about the nature of Latin deponents. I was speculating about, are they similar to Greek in that they have some kind of middle force or something similar to that that explains why they are the way they are. So here with the verb profaciskor, I could probably make a case for that. Profaciskor looks passive. It looks like it has a passive, form to it. Of course, we translate it as active because it's a deponent verb. But think about this. Consider this. There's also a verb in Latin, proficio. That's pro plus facio. Facio means to do or make. And pro means in front of. So proficio, that's just a regular, normal verb. It means to advance or go forward. Literally, proficio means I make forward, or I do forward. I do in front. I make in front. Just imagine along with me here for a moment. What if profaciskor is just a passive form of proficio in the sense of I am made to go forward? Or maybe it's middle voice. I cause myself to move forward in the sense of I depart. Also, another thing to consider is the S and the C here. There's a certain kind of verb in Latin called the inceptive verb. Inceptive verbs are verbs that show someone starting to do something. Inceptive verbs are also known as incohative verbs. In Latin, we have the verb incoho, which means to start or begin, and also incipio, which means to start. So incoative or inceptive both mean beginning. And all these verbs have an S and a C in them, like disco, walesco, conwalesco, rubesco. Rubesco is a good one. It means to start to turn red. So the S and the C here indicates an inceptive quality to this verb. So there's a lot of moving parts here in the verb proficiscor. We have pro, which means, in front of or before. We have facio, which means to do or make. We have the SC here, which signals an inceptive or inchoative verb. And we have OR, which is a signal of passive activity. So speculate with me a moment. What if in the, extremely early ancient days of the Latin language, what if this verb had some kind of middle force? Like, I cause myself to start to move forward. Here's my point. When you depart or set out, you start to move yourself forward. That's exactly what it means to depart or set out. So could it be that deponent verbs in Latin, in the prehistory of the language, could it be that they started out as some kind of middle voice with a passive form, sort of like ancient Greek? And that's how they ended up with their morphology? I don't know. I'm speculating. But the reason I bring this up is to simply point out to you a possible reason for why these verbs could be the way they are. It could be that they have these passive forms but active meanings because of some kind of linguistic process like that. So these deponent verbs could have some kind of meaning that developed over time from the prehistory of the language. I don't know, I'm just speculating, but that could be what happened. That could be why deponent verbs look the way they look, with their passive appearance but active meaning. Moving on, we have utor, a very common verb, utor, uti, usus sum, which means to use. I think we have lots of related English words like utilize and utility. And finally, we have orior, oriri, ortus sum, which means to rise. A very common related English word is the word orient or oriental. The word orient basically means east. It's not really used that much anymore. It's viewed as sort of going out of fashion. Maybe kind of Eurocentric, I think, is the way it's viewed nowadays. But anyway, if the sun rises in the east, and you say, well, the east is the place where it rises, well, a present participle for this verb, orior, is oriens, and the genitive singular, orientis. So that's where we get the word orient or oriental, because it comes from this particular verb. So the word orient simply means the place where the sun rises, the rising. And the opposite word is okido, which means to set. And so okidens means setting, and so that's where we get our English word occidental. Not accidental, but occidental with an O. So the word occidental just means western, in the sense of where the sun sets. So oriental means related to the east, occidental means related to the west. Let's move ahead a bit to 359 and 360. You may be noticing that they've packed a lot into this particular chapter. One thing they're really giving you here is some special deponent verbs that govern the ablative. They use the ablative case to express their meaning, or we could say they take the ablative, whatever word they're acting upon is in the ablative case. The 5 common verbs that do this are utor, fruor, fungor, potior, and vescor. So these are 5 deponent verbs that take the ablative case, okay, here in section 360. And there's a silly acronym you can use to help yourself remember these. I've heard it as puffy or puff-v, P-U-F-F-V. But anyway, the first letter of each of these deponent verbs that takes the ablative the first letter of each one is supposed to spell out puff V. So if you remember P-U-F-F-V, you get, not in the same order shown here, you get potior, fruor, fungor, utor, vescor. So why are we saying in section 360, why are we saying that they take the ablative? What does that mean? Well, they show you in section 359. So here in section 359, you have two model sentences. First, we have milites gladiis utebantur. So milites is nominative plural. That's the subject. That's the soldiers. And then utebantur is the verb utor, which means use. And as you can see from the form of it, it's imperfect tense. Utebantur looks like it's imperfect tense, third person plural passive. If it were just a regular normal verb, that's what it would be. It would be passive, third person plural, imperfect tense. But this is a deponent verb, so that's really an active form. It just looks passive. So utebantur says they were using, or they used to use. Remember, the imperfect tense is continuous action in past time. So milites and utebantur together say the soldiers were using. Utor is one of those special 5 verbs that takes the ablative. So when you say the soldiers were using their swords, you don't put the word for swords in the accusative. You don't say milites utebantur gladios. Instead, utor takes the ablative. And so when you say they're using something, the thing that they're using, you put that in the ablative case. So milites utebantur gladiis, or like they have it here, milites gladiis utebantur, that says the soldiers were using their swords. Okay, so utor takes the ablative, and so gladiis is ablative. That's the whole point of this. Potior does the same thing. So in number 2, Caesar is the subject, and potitus est, that's a perfect tense form of potior, the deponent verb potior. So Caesar, and then the compound tense potitus est, together they say Caesar took possession of. And so with potior, the thing that you take possession of, that goes in the ablative case. So you don't say Caesar potitus est oppidum with the accusative. You just say Caesar oppido in the ablative, potitus est. Caesar took possession of the town. Again, oppido is ablative because potior is one of those few verbs that takes the ablative. And at the bottom of this page, you'll see a special note that says potior sometimes takes the genitive. I think that's in certain idiomatic uses. So we'll see that probably coming up in our Caesar readings. Okay, let's go on now to section 361, which is the exercise portion of this lesson. Turn the recording off, do all the exercises except number 5, and when you're finished, turn the recording back on and we'll go over them together. Okay, hopefully by now you've completed your homework. Let's take a look at exercise number 1. Number 1 says this: Belgae ab extremis Galliae finibus oriuntur. As you might guess, this particular exercise has a deponent verb. In fact, lots of the exercises in this lesson will have deponent verbs because that's what we're practicing. That's the new thing we learned here. So expect lots of deponent verbs in the exercises. Here we have oriuntur. That's a form of the verb orior, which means to rise. Remember that it's related to the word orient because the sun rises in the east, and it's third person plural present tense. So oriuntur says they rise or they are rising. Remember, it looks passive, but it's not. It's not saying someone is being risen. They are being risen. No, it says they rise. And the subject here is Belgae. So together, Belgae and oriuntur say the Belgians, rise or arise. And then we have a prepositional phrase, ab extremis finibus, okay, from the farthest borders. By now you know that borders means territory, so it says from the farthest territory, and then Galliae is possessing it. That's genitive. So number 1 says, the Belgians rise from the farthest territory of Gaul. Number 2, per facile est totius Galliae imperio potiri. The first 2 words here, per facile est, they say, it is very easy. Facile means easy, and then per, on the front of it, intensifies it. It makes it stronger. So facile is easy. Per facile means very easy. And est simply means is. So per facile est, it is very easy. What is it that's very easy? Well, we have a clause here that really is the subject of the sentence. It's really a noun clause. So totius Galliae imperio potiri. The idea here is we have potiri, the infinitive of the deponent verb potior, which means to take possession of. This is a present tense infinitive. It looks passive, but it's not passive because it's a deponent verb. It's got an active meaning. So potiri says to take possession of. Potior is one of those 5 common verbs that works along with the ablative. So the thing that you're taking possession of here is in the ablative case. That's imperio. That means the power, the command, and then it's being possessed by the genitive Galliae. So the idea is to take possession of the command of Gaul. Then you have another adjective modifying Galliae, and that's totius. Totius means all, and that's one of those special adjectives called the naughty 9 adjectives. They call them naughty 9 because they have a genitive singular and a dative singular that's different from what you would expect. Here we have totius, and that is actually genitive singular. The adjective here is totus, tota, totum, which means all. We get our English word total from it. We get the Spanish word todo, like todos los días means every day. So again, that's totus, tota, totum, which means all. Instead of the genitive singular being toti or totii, instead you get totius. And the dative singular, instead of being toto with an O, it's toti with an I. So totius for the genitive and toti for the dative singular. That's the main difference. That's why these adjectives are called the naughty 9, because they're very naughty in the way they form their unusual dative singular and genitive singular. You may be wondering what's the difference between totus, tota, totum, and omnis, because they both get translated as all. The idea with omnis is that it means more like every. With totus, it means more like taking something as one large unit and saying all in sense of the whole big thing. So when I see totius here with Galliae, and they're saying to take possession of the command of the whole Gaul, I get the idea that it's one big, huge, land mass. They want to take possession of it all as one big chunk, one big territory. So number 2 says, it is very easy to secure the command of all Gaul. And so the part that says totius Galliae imperio potiri, that part of the sentence is really a noun clause that is the subject of the sentence. So to take possession of all Gaul, that's the subject, and then the verb is, and then per facile, in a sense, is a predicate adjective. So to take possession is easy. That's basically the structure of the sentence. Again, totius through potiri forms what we call a noun clause. Number 3 is next. Fiebat ut helvetii minus late vagarentur. We have a footnote. It says for fiebat, that the meaning is the result was. So let's stick with that. And then we'll translate ut as that. And then we have a result clause. And the result clause is helvetii through wagarentur. Okay, so the helvetii, and then we have the deponent verb wagarentur. That's a form of the verb wagor, which means to wander around or to roam around, no pun intended. And this is imperfect subjunctive because it's in a result clause. So what we have so far says the result was that the helvetii were wandering, or the helvetii would wander, something like that. And then late means widely, and minus means less. So number 3 as a whole says the result was that the helvetii were wandering or roaming less widely. The idea is that some of these ancient tribes would migrate around, and they would travel around and, kind of move from place to place. Here in this sentence, it's talking about how they could do that less. They could do that over less territory. Number 4 is next. Helvetii se angustos fines habere arbitrabantur. The subject is helvetii. The verb is arbitrabantur. That's the main subject and main verb. Then after that, we have an indirect statement. So arbitrabantur is a form of the verb arbitror, which means to think. So arbitrabantur is imperfect tense, third person plural, and since it's deponent, it will say they were thinking. So the main subject and verb is the helvetii were thinking, and then se is the subject of the indirect statement. So this is a classic case of indirect statement, starting with a verb of saying, thinking, feeling. So the helvetii were thinking that they, and so se is a reflexive pronoun. It's in the accusative case because the subject of an indirect statement in Latin has to be in the accusative case. So the helvetii were thinking that they, that's se, and then the verb of the indirect statement is habere. Habere is a present tense infinitive, so that means it's going to be in the same time frame as the timing of the main verb. The main verb, arbitrabantur, is in the past, so we have to put habere in the past too. Okay, a present tense infinitive in your indirect statement that stays in the same time scheme as the main verb. If it's a future tense infinitive, it's going to happen after the timing of the main verb. If it's a perfect infinitive, it's going to happen before the activity of the main verb. So remember, the tense of the verb in indirect speech, as expressed by the infinitive, is relative. The timing of it is relative to the main verb. It only expresses timing or tense in relationship to the main verb. So arbitrabantur is in the past, and habere is a present tense infinitive, so we have to put that in the past too. So in English, we'll do that, I guess, with the word had. We'll say, the helvetii were thinking that they had, and then angustos fines, narrow borders, or better yet, narrow territory. And that's pretty much all there is here for number 4. The helvetii were thinking that they had narrow territory. Let's skip over number 5 and go on directly to number 6. Number 6 says, Orgetorix dumnorigi persuasit, ut idem conaretur. Our verb here is not deponent, it's just a regular old verb, persuasit. That's a form of the verb persuadeo, which means to persuade. It takes the dative case. Orgetorix is the subject, and persuasit is perfect tense, third person singular. So our subject and verb say this, Orgetorix persuaded. The person that he persuaded, you'll find that that person's name is in the dative case, and that's dumnorigi. That's a third declension name, and so the genitive stem is dumnorig, and then you tag on the letter I for the dative singular ending. And so you get Orgetorix dumnorigi persuasit. Orgetorix persuaded dumnorix. And then the rest of the sentence tells us what he persuaded him to do. And this kind of construction here is called an indirect command. And so the indirect command, grammatically speaking, it starts out with a verb of commanding, suggesting, persuading, demanding, ordering, and then you have the word ut, and then you have the thing that somebody wants someone to do in the subjunctive. So that's the recipe for an indirect command. So if you say to someone, I demand that you wear a helmet for safety, that's an example of an indirect command. You have a verb of demanding, and then you have the word that, and then the thing you want them to do. And so that's the kind of construction we have here. He persuaded him that he try the same thing. Conaretur is a form of one of our new deponent verbs for this lesson. I told you our verb here was not deponent, and that was partially true because persuasit is not, but we do have a deponent verb here in this indirect command. Conor, C-O-N-O-R, conor means try, as in attempt, and this is imperfect subjunctive. So ut plus conaretur will say something like, that he try. Idem is a form of the pronoun idem, which means the same. So literally it says, Orgetorix persuaded dumnorix that he attempt the same, in the sense of the same thing. In English, we don't really say it that way. In English, we would say something more like, he persuaded dumnorix to try or to attempt. So in the answer key, I'll put, Orgetorix persuaded dumnorix to try the same thing or to attempt the same thing. Idem is accusative singular, by the way. Number 7 is next. Cum civitas ob eamrem incitata armis ius suum exequi conaretur. Orgetorix mortuus est. In this exercise, they're throwing in a thing that we haven't really studied yet, and that's cum as a conjunction. The word cum, as you know, can be a preposition that means with. If I say I went to the coffee shop, cum amicis meis, that means with my friends. But cum can also mean other things. It can be used to introduce a dependent clause. So basically, when you see the word cum being used to introduce a clause, there are basically 4 possibilities that I can think of. It could be cum plus an indicative verb. That's what we call a temporal clause, a cum temporal. And it just means when. Cum just means when. So like when I went to the store, I got some coffee. And again, the verb is just a regular indicative verb. But there are also 3 possibilities where you can have cum introducing a clause that has a subjunctive verb. And so when that happens, you want to pick from one of 3 basic meanings. Meaning number 1, under the circumstances that. Meaning number 2, since. That's S-I-N-C-E, since as in because. And number 3, although. And all these clauses have fancy names. Cum plus an indicative verb, meaning when, we call that, as I mentioned a moment ago, temporal. Why? Because it deals with time. Cum meaning under the circumstances that, we call that a cum circumstantial clause. Cum meaning since, we call that a cum causal clause because it's showing cause. The word since basically means because. And then when cum means although, we call that a cum concessive clause because you're conceding something to someone. You know, like, I concede to you that blah, 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 but I would argue that blah, blah, blah. And so when people talk like that, they use the word although. Although such and such is true, such and such is also true. So cum plus the indicative is a cum temporal clause, and you translate cum as when. Then you have three kinds of cum plus a subjunctive. A cum circumstantial, you translate cum as under the circumstances that. A cum causal clause, you translate cum as since. A cum concessive clause, you translate cum as although. So that's in a nutshell how you handle cum clauses. Again, we haven't covered that yet, but that's just a quick sneak preview. In this particular exercise, exercise 7, this is the kind where we're going to have cum plus a subjunctive. So we need to pick from circumstantial, causal, or concessive. So will we translate cum here as under the circumstances that, or will we translate it as since, or will we translate it as although? And the verb that works with cum here is conaretur. That's one of our new verbs for this lesson. It's deponent. It's the verb conor, which means to attempt or try. And it's imperfect subjunctive. And the subject of it is civitas, which means state. So cum civitas and conaretur together will say, under the circumstances that the state was trying, or since the state was trying, or although the state was trying. It's not really when the state was trying, because then it would be a cum temporal, and a cum temporal has an indicative verb. So that's not one of our choices. We have to pick from the three that pertain to subjunctive verbs. So cum plus a subjunctive is going to be under the circumstances that the state was trying, since the state was trying, or although the state was trying. And orgetorix mortuus est, that simply says orgetorix died. Mortuus est is a form of yet another deponent verb, morior, which means to die. So this verb is morior, mori, and mortuus sum. You can see that in the vocabulary for this lesson. So morior means I die, mori is an infinitive that means to die, and mortuus sum would be a male saying I died. If it's a woman or girl, she'd say mortua sum. If it's a neuter thing like a town, it would say mortuum sum. So orgetorix mortuus est says orgetorix died. We have the perfect passive participle, mortuus. Well, it's not really passive, it looks passive, but since this is a deponent verb, really it's active. And along with the verb est, mortuus and est together say he, she, or it died. It looks like a perfect tense passive verb, but it's not because it's a deponent verb. So the sentence structure here is, under the circumstances that the state was trying, orgetorix died. Or, since the state was trying, orgetorix died. Or, although the state was trying, orgetorix died. Those are our three choices of how this basic sentence structure will happen. So we have to figure out which one cum is. Whether it's cum circumstantial, cum causal, or cum concessive. Under the circumstances that, since, or although. Let's dig into this first clause a bit more. Ob eam rem says, on account of this thing, on account of this occurrence, on account of this circumstance, on account of this event. You know, the word res means thing, but you're supposed to translate it as some more specific term. So ob eam rem could say, on account of this reason, on account of this event, on account of this, whatever. And we have incitata as an adjective modifying civitas. Incitata means something like roused or stirred up. Armis here means weaponry or weapons, and it's in the ablative plural, so it means by means of weapons, by means of military force, by means of force, something like that. It's hard to exactly translate it into English. we could do it literally and just say arms in the sense of weapons. And then we have an idiom here. Exequi is working along with conaretur as a complementary infinitive. So the idea is they were trying to enforce. We actually have this in our vocabulary. If you go back to page 134, you'll see that exequor means to follow out, but with ius, it means enforce. So ius means something like justice or the right someone has, like if you have the right of free speech, it can mean a right like that. So here in exercise 7, we have exequi and ius working together. So the idea is conaretur, they were trying to exequi, to enforce the ius, enforce the right or the justice. And suum means its own, referring to the state. So the state, civitas, was trying to enforce its own right or its own justice. And then armis says by means of force or by means of arms. So notice the word order here. Civitas and incitata go together. It's a noun and a modifying adjective. Really, incitata is a participle, but basically it means stirred up or roused up. And then obeam rem, we could say for this reason, on account of this reason, on account of this thing. Why don't we just say on account of this reason? Not the most smooth sounding English, but nevertheless it is an accurate translation. And so civitas and incitata, they are framing around ob eam rem. So ob eam rem is nestled or nested within civitas and incitata. So it forms kind of a sandwich kind of structure. The noun and the adjective that go with the noun enclosing ob eam rem. So the idea is cum, whatever that means, cum, the state, stirred up on account of this reason, was trying to enforce its justice by means of arms, orgetrix died. So let's think for a moment, with all that stuff going on, what would the context suggest is the best way to translate cum? Although the state was trying to enforce its law, orgetrix died? No, that's not although, because they're both kind of along the same lines of things that could happen alongside each other. So it's not really a concessive kind of thing. How about since the state was stirred up on account of this reason, blah, 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 orgetrix died? That's possible. But what I think it is a cum circumstantial. So it would read like this. Under the circumstances that the state stirred up on account of this reason, was trying to enforce its justice, orgetrix died. So for me, that sounds better because it sets up the circumstances. In fact, you could even flip it and put the part about orgetrix dying, you could put that first. You could say, orgetrix died under the circumstances that the state, blah, 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 was trying to enforce its justice by force or by arms. So for me, this is a cum circumstantial. We have the word cum as a conjunction plus a subjunctive verb, that's conaretur, and that kicks off a cum circumstantial clause. So we translate cum as under the circumstances that. And what it gives us is this. Under the circumstances that the state stirred up on account of this reason was trying to enforce its own justice by arms, orgetrix died. One last comment before I go. As I mentioned, my old Latin teacher used to say that cum plus the subjunctive can mean when, since, or although. So she would have translated this as when the state, having been stirred up on account of this reason, blah, 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 orgetrix died. So she would have used the word when to translate that. And that's not all that bad, really. I mean, it is talking a little bit about timing, but really, one of my other teachers was saying that really the best way to do that is to say under the circumstances that, because it's not really talking about timing, it's talking about the background circumstances under which something is happening. So perhaps you'll see in textbooks somewhere that cum plus the subjunctive should be when, since, or although. You might hear that somewhere. You might read it in a textbook. But what I'm saying here is it's better to say not when, since, or although, but under the circumstances that, since, or although. And this is a perfect example of how that would actually play out in an actual sentence in Latin. Moving on to number 8. Helvetii se ad eam rem paratos esse arbitrati sunt. Okay, the subject is helvetii, and the main verb here is arbitrati sunt. That's a perfect tense form of one of our new deponent verbs for this lesson, arbitror, which means to think. We have a perfect participle here, arbitrati. Notice that it's plural because it agrees with helvetii. So arbitrati sunt says they thought. It's not arbitrabantur, they were thinking. Imperfect. No, it's perfect tense. It looks like a perfect passive third-person plural verb, but it's not. It's active because this is a deponent verb. Okay, so helvetii arbitrati sunt. The helvetii thought. Now we get a classic example of indirect statement being launched by a verb of saying, thinking, or feeling. As they say, verbs of the head or heart. And again, as we saw before in exercise 4, again, it's the helvetii thinking something about themselves. So the subject in the accusative, that is the subject of the indirect statement, is se, which is the helvetii. So the helvetii thought that they, and then paratos esse. That's an infinitive. It's a perfect tense, passive infinitive from the verb paro, which means to prepare. It's accusative, paratos is accusative because it has to agree with se, which is accusative. Remember that in indirect speech, you have a subject in the accusative case and then a verb that is an infinitive. So you have that accusative plus infinitive pattern. So the helvetii thought that se paratos esse, that they were prepared. And then ad eam rem means something like to this thing or for the purpose of this thing. We could translate rem as endeavor, attempt, task. The thing being talked about here is their plan to burn all their crops and move to a new place. That's really what's being talked about. So we could say endeavor. We could say the helvetii thought that they were prepared for the purpose of this endeavor. Or we could simply say for this endeavor. So for number 8, let's say this. The helvetii thought that they were prepared for this endeavor. Number 9 is next. Helvetii persuadent finitimis ut eodem concilio utantur. The subject is helvetii. The verb is persuadent, which is present tense, third person plural. So it simply says the helvetii are persuading. And then persuadeo takes the dative. Finitimis is in the dative case. And so that's who they're persuading. And that means they're neighbors. So the helvetii are persuading neighbors. And it's understood here that it's their neighbors. So in our translation, let's throw in the word their as an understood word. The helvetii are persuading their neighbors. And what are they persuading them to do? Well, the part starting with ut tells us. They're persuading them that they utantur eodem concilio. Utantur is a form of the verb utor, which is one of our new deponent verbs for this lesson. It means to use. So it's utor, uti, uti, and then usus sum. Here we have utantur, which is present tense subjunctive. If it were indicative, it would be utuntur, but with the letter A there, we get utantur, and that's present tense subjunctive. It looks passive, but it's not. It's active because this is a deponent verb. And as I mentioned earlier, this construction, grammatically speaking, is what's known as an indirect command. You have a verb of demanding, insisting, ordering, and then you have the word ut, and then a subjunctive verb. So it says, the Helvetii are persuading their neighbors that they use, and then we have eodem concilio. That means the same plan. Remember that utor is one of those 5 common verbs that takes the ablative, the puff V verbs. Potior, utor, fruor, fungor, and weskor. Puffy or puff V is a mnemonic that you can use to remember those 5. So concilio is the noun concilium, which means plan. Here it's in the ablative because it's utantur, taking the ablative. And eodem is ablative agreeing with concilio. So number 9 says, the Helvetii are persuading their neighbors that they use the same plan. To put it into more colloquial English, we could say the Helvetii are persuading their neighbors to use the same plan. That's a bit more smooth as far as English goes. Number 10 is next. Similar to number 9, but with a little bit of a difference here. Helvetii persuadent finitimis ut cum eis proficiscantur. The first part of the sentence is the same as before. The Helvetii are persuading their neighbors, ut, and then the ut part of the sentence tells us what they're trying to persuade them to do. They're trying to persuade them, ut cum eis proficiscantur. Proficiscor is a verb that means to depart or set out. It's deponent. It's one of our new verbs for this lesson. Here we have proficiscantur, which is third person plural, present tense. And then cum eis says with them. Eis is referring back to the Helvetii. Eis is a form of is ea id. That's the pronoun that we've talked about many times in the past. So number 10 says, the Helvetii are persuading their neighbors to depart with them. Literally, they're persuading them that they should depart with them. Trying to capture the subjunctiveness of it. But in smoother English, we can say they are persuading them to depart with them. It's not literal, but that's a smoother way to say it in English. Number 11 is next. Helvetii persuadent finitimis ut eodem usi concilio cum eis proficiscantur. Okay, the first part of the sentence is the same as the previous 2 sentences. The Helvetii are persuading their neighbors that they blah, blah, blah. And then we have proficiscantur, and then we have cum eis. So it's largely the same as number 10. The Helvetii are persuading their neighbors to depart with them. But then we have this new part, eodem usi concilio. So usi is going to be a perfect participle form of the verb utor, which means to use. The principal parts, utor, uti, usus sum. So for that perfect participle, usus, it looks like a passive participle, but it's really a perfect active participle because deponent verbs are active in meaning. So usus is declined like a first and second declension adjective. You could have usus, usi, or you could have feminine forms like usa or usai or usum if it's neuter. So it can be declined in all the first and second declension forms. So here we can translate usi as having used, like a perfect active participle. And as the footnote says, it's standing in agreement with the subject of proficiscantur, the neighbors. So it reads something like this. the Helvetii are persuading their neighbors that they depart with them, having used the same plan. So usi is a perfect active participle modifying the unspoken subject of profaciscantur. It's unspoken in this clause, at least. It's mentioned in the previous one that it's talking about the neighbors. And then having used, that's going to take the ablative because utor is one of those verbs that takes the ablative. That's why eodem and concilio are ablative singular, because that's the thing being used, and so they have to be in the ablative. Moving on to number 12. Allobroges per suos fines Helvetios ire non passi sunt. The subject here is allobroges. That's a Gallic tribe. And the verb here is passi sunt. That's a form of one of our new verbs for this lesson, patior, which can mean to suffer or it can mean to permit. Patior, pati, passus sum. Those are the principal parts. Passi sunt is a plural, perfect tense form of this deponent verb. It means they allowed. With non negating it, it means they did not allow. So, allobroges and then non passi sunt, those words say the allobrogi did not allow, or the allobrogi did not permit. Now we have an accusative plus infinitive construction. It's not indirect speech, but nevertheless it has the accusative plus infinitive construction. Really, it's a noun clause. The allobroges did not permit, and then the rest of it is acting like a big thing that they did not permit, like a big clause acting as a direct object. So within this noun clause here, Helvetios is the subject, what we call the subject accusative, and then ire is an infinitive that means to go. Per suos fines says literally through their own borders. Fines, as you know, as I've mentioned many times, when it's plural, it often gets translated as territory. So number 12 says, the allobrogi did not allow the Helvetii to go through their territory. The adjective suus, sua, suum is supposed to be used when it's referring back to the subject of the sentence. In this particular clause, in this subordinate clause here, the noun clause, really the Helvetii are the subject, but suos here is really connecting you back to the allobroges. So it's their own territory in the sense of belonging to the allobroges. So again, you could consider per suos fines Helvetios ire. You could consider all of that to be just one thing called a noun clause. It all acts just as a noun, which in this case is the direct object in the sentence. That's one way to picture it in your mind. And that's how you'll see it described in textbooks like Moreland and Fleischer. That's an example of a textbook that'll explain it that way. Number 13 is next. Dicitur eos per provinciam nostram iter facere conari. Dicitur is a passive form of the verb dico, which means to say, and it's third person singular, present tense, passive. So it means something like, it is said, and that's going to kick off a classic example of indirect speech. Within the indirect speech, we'll have an accusative as the subject, and then we'll have an infinitive as the verb. So, what do you see? You see eos as the subject, that's accusative plural, and then you see conari as the verb, that's an infinitive. So classic case of a verb of saying or thinking or feeling, kicking off an indirect statement. So it is said that they, that's eos, a form of is-id, it's accusative plural. And then conari is a present tense infinitive of conor, which means to try or attempt. The main verb is in the present tense, and the infinitive is in the present tense. And so within indirect speech, the tense of the infinitive verb is relative to the main verb. Konari is present tense, so that means it'll be in the same time scheme as the main verb. The main verb is dicitur, that's present tense, so we'll keep konari, as we translate it, we'll keep that in the present tense too. So we could say this, it is said that they are trying. So it is said is present tense, they are trying is present tense, so this is all present tense. Iter facere is an idiom that means to journey, to travel. Literally, it means to make a journey, or to do a journey, or to do a trip, or to do a march, to make a march. Per provinciam nostram says, through our province. Put it all together, and it says, it is said that they are trying to make a journey through our province. To put that in smoother English, we could say, it is said that they are trying to journey through our province, that they are trying to travel through our province. That's a bit smoother. Number 14 is next. Caesar ab urbe profaciscitur. The subject here is Caesar, that's Julius Caesar. Profaciscitur, that's a form of profaciscor, one of our new deponent verbs for this lesson. It means to set out or depart. It's third person singular, present tense. So it says something like Caesar is setting out, Caesar is departing, something like that. It looks passive, but it's not because profaciscor is deponent. Ab urbe means from the city. When you see the city used like that, it's referring to Rome. Rome was referred to simply as the city. So number 14 says, Caesar is setting out from the city, with the city being referred to here being Rome. Ab is from, and then urbe is the object of the preposition ab, which is ablative singular, third declension. Number 15 is next. Hortatus suos proelium commisit. The main verb here is commisit. Along with proelium, it forms kind of an idiom. Proelium means battle, and commisit, it's a compound of the verb mitto, which means to send. So it means something like to join in with the battle. Really, it means to join battle, to engage in the battle. So proelium commisit says, he joined battle. Hortatus is a perfect participle modifying the subject. By the way, the subject of the sentence is not really declared explicitly. There is no word here to be the subject. So with no explicitly stated subject, we're just using the pronoun that is included in commisit, the he, she, or it. If the word Caesar were here, then that would be the subject. Or if the word Orgetrix were here, that would be the subject. But we don't have that, and in fact, we don't even know who the subject is. But whoever it is, it has to be a man. Why? Because the participle modifying it is gendered, and it's got a masculine ending. So hortatus, that's a perfect participle. And since it's a participle, it's going to have case and gender and number. So if it were a woman doing it, it would be hortata. If it were a neuter entity, like a town, it would be hortatum. But here it's hortatus, meaning that it's a man doing it. What is hortatus? Well, it's a perfect participle form of hortor. Hortor is one of our new deponent verbs for this lesson. It means to encourage. So hortatus appears at first glance to be a passive perfect participle, but it's not passive because hortor is a deponent verb. Again, passive in form, active in meaning. So hortatus really is a perfect active participle. So we can translate it as having encouraged. And then the object of that action of encouraging, the direct object of hortatus, a participle can take a direct object, And we see that here. Suos means his own. And that's a substantive. We have to throw in a word like men, soldiers, guys. Having encouraged his own guys. Having encouraged his own men. Having encouraged his own soldiers. We have to throw in an extra word like that, men or soldiers. So again, hortatus is a perfect active participle because it's from a deponent verb. Having encouraged his own men, or simply having encouraged his men, he joined battle. Okay, that's it for another episode of Lenny's Latin class. Thank you for listening. Be sure to try to speak Latin as much as you can. If you try to say something each day in Latin, you'll find that these exercises become a lot easier. Once you get some basic familiarity and some basic practice with all the words and structures in this lesson, you should try to say something in Latin. Make up little sentences. Take an existing sentence and change it around a bit. Try to say a sentence, and then in your mind, picture the action. So you're putting the words with the pictures. Talk to your dog. Talk to your cat. You know, they won't mind. They'll listen to you. They're not doing anything else. So there are lots of ways to do spoken Latin, to do narration, to get yourself not simply just reading, having Latin come into your mind, but Latin, going out of you too. So you want Latin going in and Latin going out. And that's going to help you get a fuller language experience. So experiment with trying to say some of these sentences and keep up the good work. And we'll see you again in the next lesson.